Hey, so this is kind of a spontaneous video, but it's one that kind of encompasses aspects of previous videos that I've made, and I think it's as topical and as important as ever. So, like with all my videos, feel free, by the way, to share them, anywhere. I really don't mind. Um, I want to talk about the issue of race in America. Hugely controversial issue. Although I should emphasize, particularly white and African American racial issues. Because I think when we talk about race in America, that can refer to the history of Asian Americans, the history of Native Americans, etc. I'm talking here specifically about um, African Americans and white Americans. Um, what prompted me to make this? Well, I came across a trailer just now called Rosewood. It's a film from 1997, directed by the late John Singleton, and it's about the Rosewood Massacre of 1923 in Florida. Rosewood was a black township um, town, and it was like a similar context to many other racial tensions of that time. A white woman cried rape, and well, one thing led to another. At least six black people were killed, at least two white people. Some reports put the actual toll a lot higher. Um, Florida was one of the states that recorded among the most lynchings of the time. Um, So how far has America come since those days? Let me just say for the record, those old photographs that you see, and they were actually distributed at the time, sort of around the turn of the century, circa 1890 to about 1925. We're talking that sort of era. There were photographs distributed in the deep south, in the solid south, um, of lynchings, and it's stomach churning stuff, it really is. Um, this year actually marks the centenary of the Red Summer of 1919. Um, and one of the bloodiest race riots took place in Elaine, Arkansas. Somewhere in the region of over 200 were killed in that race riot. I believe it was the worst act of violence of any kind in the United States in the post Civil War years. Unless I'm mistaken, it was really a terrible incident, the Elaine race riot. Believe that was in the wider context of the Red Summer of 1919. In recent years, I'm talking like this decade, the 2010s, there have been a lot of big budget films exploring racial relations in America. I'm thinking of The Butler, I'm thinking of Selma, um, and there's been others. And so they've reignited the debate. There has also been real world events. There has been the Black Lives Matter movement. There has been, serious social unrest, not quite to the level of the late 1960s or to the level of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, but still serious enough. Um, and this kind of was escalating in the later years of the Obama presidency, and it's still very much there. I think the tensions are still very palpable. Um, Incidentally, I'm not coming at this from a kind of holier than thou perspective. The UK, whilst not as bad as the United States, whilst we don't quite have the same history of tension, we're definitely not devoid of it. Um, I mean, there has been significant social unrest in Birmingham and London, so we've had our own history, not lynchings, not that aspect, and certainly not segregation, but we've had our racial tensions as well. And I see some of the things that are polarizing in our society that go on in the United States, perhaps not to as deep an extent, but with Britain, the big baggage is the British Empire and the aspect of and the legacy of colonialism and all the debate around that. So this is how I see it. I'm obviously a white guy. What responsibility do white people have? I think they need to acknowledge there were historic wrongs. I think they need to acknowledge that Long after Lincoln had freed the slaves, there was deeply entrenched racial discrimination, Jim Crow laws, and all of that. But I think those things are very well documented. I don't think anyone can honestly say that America is a country that tries to censor its past in that sense. I mean, these things are extensively documented. There's museums, there's films, there's documentaries, there's statues. It's deeply entrenched now in the public psyche, and you could argue there could be a credible case that that took too long, but I think it is definitely, no one can say, for example, that the United States censors its racial problems in the same way. At least not, there may be particular episodes that are censored. I, for example, mentioned recently the zebra murders in San Francisco. I think that's kind of being overlooked, or there's been kind of been a collective amnesia about it, which was actually targeted killings of white people. But overall, I don't think it's comparable to a country like China. I mean, we're coming up to the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square, and I don't want to derail from the main subject of the video, but just as a comparison, that's just not discussed in China. It's heavily whitewashed. It isn't discussed. Nor is the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. I mean, the sort of cruelty and brutality that went on in China's Great Leap Forward was staggering, absolutely staggering. So, in that sense, I think America's been a lot more introspective of its past than other powers. Um, I would even, to make an example with a democracy, I think India, for example, I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to derail. Yeah, so where does America go from here? I think a lot of things have clearly improved. I don't think America is in any way comparable to the 1920s. Um, but the tensions are still very much there. When a white police officer kills a black man in cold blood who's unarmed, and there has been a few incidents like that, or they're shot in the back, it doesn't matter that that person may well have a criminal record. The tensions are very palpable, and I think people, particularly in the African American community, look at that and they say to white cop killing a black man in the back. Um, and like I say, when the racial tensions have happened here, again, it doesn't matter that we had a case that sparked London riots. The guy who was killed was no angel. He was a black guy. He was in London. He had a lengthy criminal record. Um, but when he died, it didn't. I think his name was someone Duggan. I don't remember exactly. But to black activists, it didn't matter that he had a criminal record. That was, oh, the police have killed a black guy. And I think this demonstrates just how deeply entrenched some of these tensions and mistrust still is. The Dallas shooting, where 5 Dallas police officers were killed 3 years ago. The cruel irony of that is Dallas was a city that had actually come a long way in terms of integration. And unless I'm mistaken, the Dallas PD had a good record in terms of community relations, or at least a greatly improved record compared to other police forces around the country. I think sometimes, especially outsiders, we're guilty of looking at the American police as one homogenous group, whereas the reality is there's big differences between each police department. Um, I was infuriated by the Eric Garner case. I thought that was appalling. I mean, that was just, you know, even if the guy had technically been committing an offense by, selling unlicensed cigarettes, I mean, for him to be choked in that way, and then to be the white cop to be acquitted was absolutely appalling. And that was in New York City. That wasn't the South. This is another thing. One of the many misconceptions about America and race is that all the worse injustices occurred in the South. It's probably true that they did, but there were and are injustices in the northern states. I mean, one of the worst lynchings took place in, I believe it was Illinois. Forget the name of the place now. It was about 1920. uh, it eludes me now. It was I think it was Duluth, Minnesota, or I don't quote me on this. It was about 1920, and it garnered attention because it was a northern city. And this wasn't like this was a particularly brutal lynching. The three black men were burned afterwards. It was sickening. Um, there was a lynching culture in the South that there were some white men lynched as well, um, over false accusations. From other white people, but the overwhelming majority was African American. That's where the racial dynamic came into it. In the West, in the old frontier, lynch mob justice, affected a lot of people. It was black, white, and Native American, and Chinese. Chinese railroad workers suffered particularly severe racial discrimination and violence. Some of the worst massacres actually in America were against Chinese workers, but not to detract. What I really want to focus on here, I'll get to the point with this. How can America move forward when there is such deeply entrenched mistrust? I think that looking at the today's situation, I think there are too many conservative white Americans who are too quick to defend the police. That's my gut instinct. But I also feel that there are black community leaders that don't acknowledge, for example, in a city like Chicago, the number of black men being killed by other black men far exceeds the number of black men killed by white police. And we've similar problems here. Because America has got a very glaring history of institutional racism, I think so much of race in America is viewed through the prism of it must be racist. So there will be police shootings where there may be racial prejudice at stake, but there will be other cases whereby it's more connected to a training culture, I think, and a kind of militarized police, and also the fact that they genuinely do have to face very dangerous situations. Um, but there are racial components. Interestingly enough, one of the few prosecutions was a black police officer who shot a white woman. This was the Australian woman who was killed in, I think it was Milwaukee. Um, that case got quite a lot of attention. Now, he was recently charged with that and actually sentenced. So that was an interesting outcome. What I find very irresponsible is when people push racial divisions that instead of trying to build bridges only increases the tensions. And I think in this regard, CNN, for example, I definitely don't blame them for reporting on racial issues. But when, for example, they report about an incident, a racist incident where a black person is a victim, that's fine. I think that's legitimate. But when they fail to report that a black gang has killed an innocent white person, and there has been some such incidents, that bias is going to only sow divisions deeper. When black community leaders berate corrupt white police officers, which is it's a valid critique, but they ignore the the misery that black gangs cause, the likes of the Bloods and the Crips, and the toxic influence, I would say, of R&B, aspects of R&B and rap. I mean, I don't think that can be underestimated. I don't think it's necessarily the number one motivator of violence, but I mean, I think that's a major factor here is so-called drill music. It's toxic. I don't believe it's the number one thing, just before anyone misunderstands me, but I think it doesn't help. Um, they will say, "Oh, they're just messengers." I'm critical of that, but that's maybe more to explore in another video. But let me make a point. I came across a book recently, and this is also lapping over into the British situation. The title of the book was Why I No Longer Speak to White People About Race. Now, as a white person, I think I have a responsibility to acknowledge that, particularly in America, there was an institutional white racism. There was. But there are certain black activists who think that therefore gives them a green light to hate all white people. I mean, even on this trailer that I was talking about, I was seeing comments, presumably from black people, saying, this is why you can never trust the whites. The whites, like a generalization. Um, I say to black people who think all white people are bad, who think all white people are institutionally racist, you're not building bridges, you're part of the problem. Because during the civil rights movement, there were many white Americans who were very sympathetic to that movement, and in some cases they paid with their lives. They are honoured by the Civil Rights Museum, but in a collective memory, there is still certain black activists who talk in terms of the whites. So I don't think America can move forward on race if white racism is condemned, but when black activists make these lazy and crude generalizations of the whites, that mentality isn't challenged. I mean, the book I'm talking about, it was in Waterstones. It's in a major bookstore, yet it's blatantly a racist message. Why I no longer talk to white people about race. So I think identity politics is doing a lot more harm than good. I really do. I feel that where there is clear injustice, it definitely needs to be addressed. So, for example, if you have a situation in the States of a disproportionate number of unarmed black men being killed by police, that needs to be discussed. But that shouldn't translate as every time a black man is killed by the police, he must be unarmed. Because there's cases where they are actually armed and they do have a violent record. Now, the police have as much right to defend themselves as anyone else. So, so much of this debate gets overshadowed by people who have a tunnel vision on both sides. I mean, you get white racists and you get white conservatives who want to downplay the problem, but you also get black racists and black activists who think that the answer to America's racial problems are to just vilify all white people and say they're all part of the problem. I fear that, 8 years of the Obama presidency, the first African American president, or technically mixed race, but unfortunately it didn't really bring America that far forward, and I don't think that's necessarily Obama's fault. I think this cannot be put down to one man or one leader or one politician. I think it's a collective thing. Same in the UK. I mean, the racial tensions that we're seeing in this country maybe aren't on the same scale as the United States, and certainly not in terms of a black white thing. Here, it's more a Muslim, non Muslim thing that's going on right now. And again, you get the Islamists, and then you get some people who are against all Muslims, but that's a palpable tension here. Right, I'm at 19 minutes, so I'm going to round this up. So, how do I see it? I find it very depressing. I find it depressing that in almost the third decade of the 21st century, there is still a palpable sense of racial tensions in America. I mean, they're always going to be there in a country of over 300 million people. There's always going to be racists. You cannot totally eradicate racist people. You cannot totally eradicate racist thinking. Unfortunately, on some level, it's always going to be there. But I think the media needs to be responsible in how they talk about these things. I'm not saying they shouldn't talk about them. I think they should, but I think they should be responsible in how they talk about them. And I've seen, particularly from liberal media, I mean, a lot of this comes down to politics. I think I was watching CNN last night about the latest mass shooting. On that area, I'm absolutely with CNN. I think Chris Cuomo was raising very valid points. But on racial issues, I think that CNN, I mean, they don't talk about black on black crime anywhere near as much as they should. They don't talk about the sort of violence that goes on in Chicago anywhere near as much as they should. At least, they might make the report, but they won't analyze it in depth the way they would about, for example, um, black men being killed by the police. Black Lives Matter as a movement won't talk about black on black violence. If their issues black people being killed, why do they not talk about that? At least not to anywhere near the same extent. And white racists are white racists. They need to be challenged. Their ideology needs to be challenged. The president, his supporters say that, well, he's just responding to political correctness. I think Trump has a lot to answer for as well. If CNN is one extreme, promoting a liberal bias, Trump is the other, pandering to the likes of the KKK, then backtracking. So it's really, it's a situation that's only going to get worse if people are not responsible about how they talk about things. And that comes down to news anchors. It comes down to, I mean, when Don Lemon, for example, was talking about those young Trump supporters at the rally a while back, and he basically smeared them on air. Things like that. It's very irresponsible. So there's responsibility of so-called community leaders. There's also responsibility of media outlets, and frankly, there's responsibility of individuals. So when people come out and say things like the whites are this or the blacks are that, it's only fanning the flames. I mean, as a white person, I'm disgusted by what white people have done. I don't think I'm responsible for it, but I think, you know, I should acknowledge it. But I also feel angry that black racists ignore the fact there were white people who joined the civil rights movement and in some cases were murdered for it. To be fair to the film Selma, it did cover that. It covered the white pastor and who was murdered for his support of King. So the only way I see America going forward is for people to not to ignore the issue. Race has to be discussed, but I think identity politics, constantly looking at everything through the prism of racism, constantly, I mean, or the Hollywood approach of box ticking everything and constantly talking about how black is this film, how many, the obsession that Hollywood has these days with identity politics. I don't see that helping America's racial problems. I see it only deepening the divide because a lot of white Americans look at that and they think, it's Hollywood just shit stirring, basically. I think that's how they see it. I'm not talking about necessarily the films that have been made. Some of these are powerful, moving films, but I'm talking about this obsession with identity politics, for example, in the Oscars, in Oscars So White, things like that. That is not what Martin Luther King had in mind. That is a totally different realm, I think, from. I don't think Martin Luther King, and not just King, other civil rights leaders, I don't think they had in mind, um, let's have a situation where we're going to call the Oscars racist because they don't have black nominees in this particular year, even though there's been plenty of black nominees, and there has. If you actually look, I mean, if we're talking about making it more representative of America, if you look at the nominees or the representation even in films versus the population of the United States, it actually balances out about the way it should be. That's ignored by those who want to push, oh, it's all racist. I really am skeptical of people who immediately jump on it's racist. And there are powerful people in the media, I think, who have a lot to answer for by stirring this up. So, from my perspective, there is collective responsibility. Yes, race needs to be spoken about. Yes, racism needs to be spoken about. But there cannot be double standards. So, a black American who feels angry about police shootings, I understand that. I can appreciate their anger. But if they're then going to say, oh, well, therefore it's okay to demonize all white people, that cannot be the way forward. How is that going to help white people who are sympathetic but don't like being smeared with the same brush? I mean, that book that I mentioned, how the hell does that help anything? How the hell does a book like that get published? Just imagine a white writer saying, I'm going to publish a book saying why I no longer speak to black people about race because I'm tired of being vilified as a white person. I would make the case that both black and white Americans are vilified. Black Americans perhaps feel aggrieved that they always get smeared as thugs, as gang members, and that's not fair. It isn't fair to say that because particular cities have a problem with black on black, gang violence. You know, the experience of black men would say we're tired of being followed around in convenience stores, but then a lot of white Americans would say, well, we're tired of being, smeared as one and the same as we're tired of being blamed for what our ancestors done. We're tired of being smeared for Jim Crow in the 30s and so on. So this sounds to me like common sense, but don't generalize. And yet that basic common sense factor just seems to have been forgotten, seems to have been sidelined. Right, I'm going to wrap this up. I've spoken for a lot longer than I intended.